All right. So that's a new feature. So everyone should be aware that the meeting is being recorded. And I am going to jump back into the Hume slides just to spend a little bit of time before transitioning to today's topic on the major philosophical, epistemological, and to some extent metaphysical implications or upshots of Hume's radical empiricism. Okay. So just to bring us back a little bit, I want to ask you guys some questions after we're more or less clear as a group of what's going on in this argument about the applicability of this approach to our contemporary lives and how we understand experience. Let me see. So, which slide should I go back to? Try and find this one. Okay. So let's unpack more carefully this problem of induction, or spend a little bit more time analyzing this as a problem. So the problem of induction is the problem of justifying our present beliefs, and that's one thing that we'll talk about as well before transitioning to time travel. What exactly is a belief? The problem of justifying our beliefs in matters of fact. So who can, in your own words, distinguish, just in terms of the language that we've adopted for this discussion, what is the difference between a fact and a matter of fact based on what we discussed last week?
Well, I guess a fact is just, isn't it just like a fact, like something true? And a matter of fact is like something true, known, like based off of experience.
So if you're distinguishing the two based on the difference of experience, well then how are you gauging the truth of the fact if it's not connected to experience?
Maybe you're like believing someone saying this is a fact. Okay, like I believe you, I guess.
Well, let's leave belief aside just for the moment to clarify the distinction between a fact and a matter of fact. So without using the idea of belief yet, so I kind of give the answer away here. Anybody?
Is it what you're saying there in the slide? Um, the sense experience, like a matter of fact, is inferring something from the sense experience?
Um, inferring something from past sense experience that's not presently available in connection to the issue or question or observation at hand, right? So a fact, as I put it here, is something that is presently observed, right? And a matter of fact is something that is within the realm of factuality, which means insofar as whatever is at issue is to be confirmed or verified as true, then that truth, in the event that it will be verified, is contingent on observation. but the issue is there is no present observation. So for example, it is a matter of fact, if I pose a particular question about what's going on the surface of Jupiter, right? That's a matter of fact. But because I am incapable physically, technologically, of going to Jupiter to verify whatever it is that's going on the surface of that, I can't come to any final or conclusive determination about the factuality of the focus of that inquiry, right? So I can speculate, I can pose various open-ended questions about what might be going on the surface of Jupiter or Uranus or some other distant planet. And perhaps in the distant future, when we're technologically, scientifically capable of visiting these places, or at least extending our gaze technologically through various mechanisms, instruments, and so forth, then whatever I'm speculating about now can either be proven or disproven. So it's a fact that I'm holding this coffee cup, but it's a matter of fact what's going on the surface of Jupiter. So to the extent that we can scientifically verify some hypothesized state of affairs or condition of reality, then the truth, once it's discovered, if it's ever discovered, will happen through empirical investigation, that is, empirical verification. So then, and this is the language I use here, a fact is a matter of fact, but it's one that has been verified by a present observation. It has been confirmed, right? So then matter of fact is broader than that. A matter of fact would be something that I can make certain inferences about, but notice that the scope and extent and nature, character of that inference, as it happens in each kind of instance or case, is constrained or conditioned by my past experiences, my past observations. So I can speculate, maybe as a writer of science fiction, for example, I can speculate wildly on what's going on the surface of Jupiter, but even that open-ended, fanciful, sort of fictitious speculation will be to some extent constrained by the nature and extent, depth, and breadth of my own past experience. And also what I have learned from the experience of others. So for example, I see with my eyes a fire burning a building 300 yards away. So I can say it is a fact. It's not simply anymore a matter of fact. If I was asking a question about, is there a fire? I might have heard some vague report, for example. Maybe I caught a very brief snippet of news on the radio. But in fact, that was a story about a fire that took place years ago, right? But in any case, I think, oh, there might be a fire at this part of town. So I'm wondering about that. I go to the part of town, what was previously a matter of fact, that is a condition of reality that would be confirmed or verified or disproven by an immediate sense experience. It has now been transformed into a fact. So I can now say there is a fire burning. Yet, so that's what I find, what I give here in proposition 2. Yet, looking at proposition 1, looking at proposition 2, while I visually perceive the fire burning 300 yards away, it is at present too distant from me for me to experience the heat that I, of course, typically associate with flames and fires. Yet, I infer that the fire would burn me if I were to touch it based on my understanding of the nature of fire and how it behaves as a physical phenomenon, right? And notice that I do that without any great difficulty or effort. I perceive the fire visually and I make an inference based upon how I understand fires, and we can unpack that more carefully, that it will be hot and that it's a bad idea for me to run up to it and stick my hand into it or run into the burning building. So the question isn't whether we make such inferences on matters of fact. So while it is a fact visually that there is a fire burning the building, it's a matter of fact that this particular fire would be hot to the touch because I'm not presently experiencing the heat. So then how do we move from one, a fact that is a present observation grounded in immediate experience, to a kind of inference of which we have no present experience, right? So that's really the question of induction. And so induction, as opposed to deduction, is a mode of logic by which we make generalizations about the future, so temporally, or about areas of present reality that are withheld from our immediate experience, such as the heat generated from a fire that I infer. So the question is, how do we do this? So for example, how is it that I'm so confident, based on my experience, that the sun will rise tomorrow? I make that kind of argumentative, inductive conclusion without really being aware of it. I just sort of assume, I take for granted, it is a reliable inference that the sun will rise tomorrow, right? And so this is something that we naturally do all the time, but the question is, how do we do it, and to what extent are we justified, rationally speaking, in making these inductive inferences? So this is the problem of induction. I just wanted to make sure that we're all clear about this. So does this make sense as a problem? And this isn't the full consequence or a series of implications that can be drawn from it yet. So remember, by Hume's fork, and I can go back there briefly, and this is where we can locate within the possible foundation of human knowledge, inductive reasoning. So it would be over here under matters of fact. So matters of fact, which is the broad area of reality that is available to us on the basis of experience, right? So if you were to distill down the essential ground or foundation for both of these kinds of understanding or knowledge, for matters of fact, it would be experience. That is to say, without experience, there can be no matters of fact or factuality as such. And because we're dealing with matters of fact, we're dealing with that which is always uncertain. It is a posteriori, which means it's something that we obtain after experience, dependent on experience, or in other words, contingent on experience. And this is where we put inductive reasoning to work. So we make inferences about that which is, strictly speaking, unknown because it hasn't been experienced yet, on the basis of what is known. So that's a good way, I think, to understand induction. It's making a conclusion or arriving at a conclusion about something that is unknown on the basis of what is known. Or in other words, arriving at a conclusion about that which is not experienced on the basis of that of which we have experience, or what we are experiencing or have experienced in the past. And the problem is, when we're dealing with such matters of fact, the contrary, so the opposite of whatever conclusion you obtain, can always be conceived of without contradiction. So for example, I can conceive of the possibility of the sun not rising tomorrow, and I'm not contradicting myself in the same way that I am if I try to conceive of 2 + 2 equaling 37, right? That's inconceivable. So think back to the John Perry dialogue, where Gretchen Weyrob was demanding not the probability of life after bodily death, but the possibility, which she defined or characterized in terms of conceivability, right? So that's what we mean here. We're talking about logical conceivability or possibility. And this is what will inform or motivate our approach to the problem of time travel once we transition to David Lewis. Okay, so then the question is, how do we make such inferences? What is the missing premise? So let's go back to this setup. I actively perceive, in Hume's language, I have an immediate sense impression, a visual one, of the fire burning 300 yards away. And then I infer that if I were to touch that fire, it would burn me. So now we're trying to figure out how we do that. So how do I know that the fire is going to burn me? Just in your own case, how would you answer that? How is it that you've arrived at this knowledge of the nature of fire?
Because I have experienced the heat of fire, and I have been burned before, and I have seen people get burned, and I have been told that fire can burn people. So
Yeah.
I assume when I see fire, and I associate that sight with the knowledge that fire can cause burns.
Good, perfect. So you probably can't see this, but I have a severe burn scar on my right hand from when I was 1 year old. My parents weren't paying attention because they were watching the news. There was a story about John Lennon's recent murder, so that gives my age away. And I had crawled into the kitchen and opened up the broiler and put my hands on it. And I was in the hospital for a couple weeks because of it. But why did I do that? Well, I obviously, as a baby, had no understanding of the nature of heat or fire because it was absent from my background of experience. And I was obviously too young to be impressed upon by abstract warnings, for example, about heat and so forth. Although after this incident, I was particularly acutely aware of the dangers of fire and heat, and so I avoided them. And so that experience, in a really powerful way, built into my basic epistemic orientation to the world, such that I believed very strongly. So here we're examining the very pathway or structure through which beliefs get shaped, sustained, and articulated. So from my experience, I acquired a particular belief about the nature of fire, and that belief served, you might say, a crucial evolutionary kind of protective mechanism for me. That is to preserve my bodily health and integrity. And so I no longer I had no interest, in fact, in touching hot things. But the thing is, I would never have come to that belief without the necessary sources of experience, which gave rise to it. So then the missing premise, then, what allows me to move from an immediate observation of sense to some non-sensory inference, is experience. But experience can't do all the work, right? Because let's see, let's go back to Russell here. Let's examine Bertrand Russell. Just because the past, this is a famous way that Russell, this 20th century British philosopher, presented Hume's problem of induction in a nutshell. So just because past futures have tended to resemble past pasts, it doesn't follow necessarily that future futures will resemble future pasts. That is to say, just because all of the particular flames in my previous experience have had the effect of heat, that is to say, in my past experience, I think that the presence of flame or fire causes, as an effect, heat. Just because there has been this correlation or conjunction of a constant nature between flame and heat in my past, it doesn't mean that flames that I encounter in the future will necessarily behave in that way. And that's because, and this is getting us back to understanding the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning. That's because, by definition, all inductive arguments, no matter how compelling, no matter how strong the premises are by definition invalid. That is, by the standard of deductive argumentation. So for example, I can say the sun came up 1,000,000 years ago, the sun came up 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 1 year ago, 5 days ago. I can supply as many premises as I want of that nature, but I still cannot conclude on its basis necessarily that the sun will rise tomorrow. And that's because in a deductive argument, everything that you find in the conclusion of the argument is already supplied in some way in the premises. That is, when it comes to deduction, it's illegitimate to smuggle into the conclusion any sort of data or belief or premise or idea that was not already included in the propositions that organize the premises that would supposedly justify or support the conclusion. And in the argument I just gave, which results in the idea that the sun will rise tomorrow, that's an inference about the future, but all of the premises had to do with the past, right? So that conclusion is actually invalid. But it doesn't mean that it's a bad conclusion. It just means that we need to apply a different logical standard to the reasoning at work there. So if we apply the deductive standard, it fails. So we know we're not using deduction, we're using induction, which means based on our past experience, we can expect something to happen in the future. And that has nothing to do with the hard necessity of validity, such that, for example, if I say all humans are mortal, Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates is mortal, there's absolutely no other conclusion I can draw from those premises. It is guaranteed to be true. But inductive arguments are not like that. They don't deal with validity. Instead, they operate on the basis of probability. So I would say it's a strong conclusion that the sun will rise tomorrow, probabilistically, which means if there's a greater than 50% chance that the content of your inference will be realized or will be borne out to be true, then you're dealing with a strong inductive argument. Okay, so, but the question is, to what extent is our past experience legitimate in this way? And so his conclusion, Hume's conclusion, he denies that any species of inductive inference, so moving as we have tried to do from the observed to the unobserved, so from fact to matter of fact, such as causal inference. So I infer heat, for example, as an effect from flame. It cannot be rationally justified. So this is a really provocative argument that's still being debated, and there's no conclusive answer to it. Although Kant, who criticized Hume's skepticism on personal identity and self, gave a kind of answer that many philosophers find satisfying, but it's not universally embraced. But how can we justify this? So we claim then, how can I say that just because I've experienced fire in such a way in the past, that my future encounters of it will be similar? Well, remember, we assume what scholars refer to as the principle of the uniformity of nature. So I think that the fire that I see before me, that I haven't yet felt by the touch, will be hot because all the fires that I've known in my past experience have been hot. And here's the assumption, here's the presupposition that we'll examine. I do that because I tend to think that nature and the phenomena that we understand as part of nature operate consistently. So nature in itself is a consistent pattern of organized forces, such that if something happens in the past, all other things being equal, if the conditions are similar, it will happen again in the future. So I just assume as true that nature behaves uniformly. That means that my past can be a legitimate and helpful guide for the future. But now the question is, how do we know the principle of the uniformity of nature? How can we be sure that it's true? So if we know that it's true, going back to Hume's fork, it's either true as a relation of ideas or as a matter of fact. But what distinguishes knowledge by relations of ideas from knowledge of matters of fact is such that when you're examining a deductive conclusion, for example, or a mathematical formula, or a conceptual definition, the contrary or the opposite, any proposed alternative to the conclusion cannot even be conceived of without contradiction. So I can't conceive of 2 + 2 equaling anything other than 4. I can't conceive of what it would be like to be standing and not standing at the same time. I can't conceive of a bachelor, for example, that's not an unmarried male. Yet, we know that this isn't the way we can respond to the question of how we come to the conclusion of the uniformity of nature, because I can conceive of the future shaping up radically different from my past experience. I can conceive of going up to that fire I see burning 300 yards away and it being cold. I would be, of course, quite surprised, to say the least. And I would perhaps adjust my supposed understanding of the phenomenon presently before me. I would try to explain it in some other way. But Hume's point is that's simply how we're naturally constituted. And then we can't do so, we can't prove, we can't justify the principle of the uniformity of nature as a matter of fact on the pain of circularity, because that's precisely what it is that we're trying to justify. So we would be justifying the conclusion with the premise. And so this is how I depict that graphically. So we start from matters of fact. Our understanding of how the world works and how we ought to navigate that world is based on matters of fact. That is to say, real existence, which has to be understood through the pathways of sense. In other words, through experience. And why is experience so important? Well, because it's in experience that we understand cause and effect relations. So because of my experience as a baby touching the hot surface on the broiler, I have come to associate heat as the effect of certain signs of causes. And so from that experience, I infer from causes which appear similar, I expect a similar effect. So if I see a fire which appears similar to fires I've seen in the past, that is, as a potential cause, then I will infer a similar effect. So what I experienced as an effect of that causal setup. But then the question is, how can I really rely on my past experience as a helpful and legitimate guide for my inferences about the unobserved or about the future? Well, I assume the principle of uniformity of nature, that the future tends to resemble the past. And now the question is, how do we know that? Where do we go from here? Well, again, it can't be through relations of ideas, because I can imagine that I'm quite surprised, as I just gave the example of touching a fire that feels cold or maybe even wet. That would be quite strange. But I can conceive of it. And I can't justify rationally my knowledge or supposed knowledge of the principle of the uniformity of nature by appeal to matters of fact, because that's exactly the thing, as you see from the beginning here, that I'm trying to justify in the first place. So we end up going in a circle. Does that make sense? Everybody with me still?
Yep.
Okay. So, as a sort of proto-psychologist, because ultimately this is what Hume's effort is, this is his project. He's trying to delimit and map out the very nature and structure of consciousness or the mind. So now the question is, if there's no rational justification for our inductive inferences, and that's really a strong conclusion. I just want to make sure that we're clear about that, because it's through induction that we navigate the world successfully or unsuccessfully. It's through induction that we take actions which will secure our livelihood or undermine our very being in the world. And so it's even the most necessary logical system of thought or means through which our beliefs and ideas are organized, by which science as we know it is carried out, right? So think of, in a nutshell, the scientific method as testing hypotheses that are proposed largely on the basis of past experience, testing such hypotheses through experimental setups, right? So this is what Hume has in mind in terms of the experimental method. Well, that relies upon our experience, making inferences about the future, and we can perhaps be secure in the conclusions that we make from this or that individual experiment, but we can't be sure that the truths that we arrive at there will hold as necessary, that is, as rationally certain for every other incident or every other comparable or analogically similar instance. So now the question is, well, why do we do this? Why is it that as a matter of nature, without me having to make a particular choice, I come to these beliefs? Well, Hume just says that's the way we are. And so in this way, Hume is a kind of comedian, I want to suggest. He sets up, and we've already experienced this in connection to the problem of personal identity. He sets up these major points of skepticism. We should be skeptical that there is a self. We should be skeptical that our understanding of basic cause and effect relations are completely groundless, completely unfounded. We should be skeptical even of the existence of a so-called outside world, according to Hume, because of course, all we have access to are our immediate sense impressions. So when I talk about facts, I'm really just talking about impressions. That is the very substance or content of my experience. And I can't make any claims about what's going on in so-called objects out there in the world, independent of my experience or the experience of others. So for this reason, though, unlike Berkeley, Hume doesn't go the dramatic metaphysical route and claim idealism, that everything is just an idea in some consciousness, but instead he thinks that we should repudiate metaphysical questions altogether, right? That it's not a question that can even be meaningfully answered, so who cares? Just set that aside. But in any case, he leaves the door open for what might be a really distressing and gnawing skepticism. But then at the end of the day, here's his comedian character. He says, these questions, which seem to be so important, so intractable, and so devastating, once you leave the philosophy classroom, as it were, Hume says, you won't even be able to make yourself give a shit about them. Right? So he says at the end of the day, you go out in the evening, you play backgammon, is the example he used. You play backgammon or pool or something with your friends, you have a few drinks, and you can't even care at all about these things, right? So the problem of induction is only when we want to rationally justify as necessary our understanding of or beliefs about cause and effect in terms of necessary connection. That is to say, if I want to hold that there is a necessary connection between flame and heat, I can't rationally justify that. But I can say that there is a constant conjunction in my past experience between the phenomena of flame and heat. And it's because those phenomena, those events, are constantly conjoined. So where there has been flame, there has also been heat. My mind is structured in such a way by nature that I am incapable, in a practical sense, of decoupling or disassociating flame from heat, such that I can't even make myself think as a matter of fanciful fiction that if I were to touch this fire, it would feel like cold jello or something. That's possible, but I can't make myself believe that. And so induction then for Hume is a matter of feeling, not reason. It has nothing to do with rationality. So in the end, we might say it's not even logical. It's simply feeling. So it's a matter of habit in terms of my past experience that I tend to associate flame and heat. And then here's the important upshot of his so-called naturalistic solution. Even if we recognize that these inferences cannot be justified or rationalized as they can be, say, through relations of ideas and deductive argumentation, it's not as if this is going to change how we behave. It's not going to change how we experience and understand the world. We will, in any case, continue to reason and act on the basis of these inductive conclusions as if they were rationally justified. So then what exactly is a belief? A belief is not some idea, a different idea that we can attach to a previous idea and say, maybe you're just comparing possible conditions of the world or possible ways of explaining some state of reality or some phenomenon, and then entertaining a series of these possible things. So for example, I believe, or excuse me, leaving aside belief for the moment, the world, the universe, and this connects to our time issue, here are possibilities, right? The universe always existed, right? The universe came to be at a particular time through a particular process or mechanism, whether that is divine creation or the Big Bang or whatever else. So these are ideas, and then I attach a third idea to one of them, and that's my belief. So I have the understanding that the world was created or the universe was created at a particular time. Let's say I'm religious, and I understand that to be the account given in biblical scripture, in Genesis. So now I'll take this third idea, belief, and attach it to that one. That's not how Hume understands belief. And that's because the mind, as we've seen, is free to combine any of its ideas. It begins with simple ideas, which, remember, is a copy of an original impression. And then we take those simple ideas and we can construct them in complex ways. So for example, think of the idea of a gold mountain, a mountain that's like shining gold. Well, I imagine you can immediately conjure up such an image in your head, even though you've never perceived a gold mountain, you've never experienced it. Well, that's because you have seen a mountain, so you have had an impression in your experience of a mountain. You've also seen gold, so you've encountered gold before. So those are impressions, and then they give rise to ideas. So I can think about mountains, even when I'm not dealing with them, in a sensory manner, and just as I can think about gold. And then I take these simple ideas that allows me to think about these material aspects of the world, and I can combine them. So now I combine them into a complex idea of gold mountain. And I can do that without attaching any particular belief to it. So a belief then is a really vivid idea that requires, for its background substance, some dimension of experience. And this is why I can't accurately explain the phenomenon of red to a blind person, to someone who's never perceived red before, or any color, whatever. So let me go back to that. So then a belief is a feeling. So if I believe, for example, that fire that's burning 300 yards away will burn me, this is something that I can't shake off and I cannot just freely adopt. So we don't arrive at our conclusive beliefs through any sort of self-conscious, rational, self-selective process. We are simply compelled to arrive at the beliefs that we have. And so what separates a belief, strictly speaking, from a fiction, from a fantasy, is that when it comes to a belief, there is a strong sentiment or attitude that attaches itself in an ineliminable way to the belief, where that does not happen when it comes to mere fanciful speculation or the free sort of turning or exchange of ideas. So then, while it is conceivable, for example, if you're watching baseball, while it's conceivable that when the batter hits the ball, that ball will turn into a sparrow and fly away, you can conceive of that. So to think that that's going to happen is not irrational, according to Hume. It's not contradictory, like 2 plus 2 equaling 8 would be, for example. But you can't just freely arrive at that. That's not going to be something that you can turn into a belief. So you can think, yeah, it's possible that this ball is going to turn into a sparrow and fly away, but you can't believe that because you have never experienced baseballs, batters, and bats to operate in the world in such a manner, right? So you can't even force yourself to arrive at this weird conclusion, even though it's conceivable. Yet you're not rationally justified in your common sense conclusion of what's going to happen when the batter hits the ball. So does that make sense? Are any comments or questions about that? What do you guys think? So how can we apply this? And we'll take a quick break and then we'll jump into the time travel business. But what sort of implications does this have for some of the major problems that we're facing as a species? These are global problems that, of course, manifest in dramatically different ways locally, as the case might be. But what are some examples of major world historical problems that are confronting us?
Maybe that, like, I guess the world is like just like getting destroyed by us because of like our pollution and stuff.
Yeah, so think about anthropogenic climate change. So the fact is, roughly 98% of the scientific community has arrived at consensus of the existence of anthropogenic climate change, that is human-caused climate change, and the severity of it. And we're not talking about a distant future of problems. We're seeing these major global issues manifest now in terms of, for example, rising sea levels. The capital of Indonesia, for example, just a few years ago, was moved in anticipation of these effects. Yet, in terms of the public discourse, there seems to be, in any case, remaining still in 2021, widespread disagreement about this, right? And so how can we explain that? So many people don't think that there really is an issue at all with global climate change. Maybe it's because they're not experiencing immediately anything of that nature. In terms of climate change, they have available, in terms of their immediate understanding, some vague impressions about weather and changing weather patterns. So you hear the sentiment expressed often, oh, well, the weather changes all the time, which suggests a misunderstanding of the nature of climate and also the nature of what it means to be global in scope. And that's because we don't experience reality globally. We're always experiencing reality from this or that limited, finite perspective. And so our beliefs of the world are constrained by the material supplied by our background experience. And it's not so easy as if we can just flip a switch to change our beliefs, right? So think about racism. Think about the common denial that there's even in existence the problem of institutional racism. And that's because many people don't experience these problems firsthand. And so it's very difficult for them, especially insofar as they're not engaged in conversation with those whose background experience is quite different. It's very difficult for them to arrive at the beliefs by which they can confirm in their understanding the reality of these difficulties that don't seem to, in an immediate sense, involve them. Right? So for example, many people deny the reality of white privilege or something like that. And that's because the very medium through which white privilege manifests itself in everyday events and occurrences remains invisible. It remains largely inaccessible to the immediacy of sense impressions. And so we disagree on these really important things, and even leaving aside institutional racism to talk about the more commonly recognized interpersonal racism. So there are individuals who are overt, self-conscious white supremacists. And we think, for the most part, that racism and white supremacy are bad. They are elements of our contemporary world that we should work to overcome and to reverse. Yet, someone might even be able, who identifies as a white supremacist, someone might eventually come to the idea that it's bad, but they can't just change their view, right? You can't just suddenly, like again, flipping a switch, change your belief. Work is involved, right? The hard work of learning the perspective of others, that is, gaining an opening into an obscure world of which your immediate navigation of this reality has not been colored or has not been made a part. And so Hume then gives us some major epistemological philosophical resources to consider more helpfully these difficulties that are plaguing us now. And that coming to what we understand, or what most people would understand to be a truth in terms of an adequate belief about the world, isn't a purely intellectual or rational endeavor, which can be sufficiently achieved by simply getting the facts out there, right? So if anything, we've seen in recent months and recent years, the proliferation of information, the widespread availability of what we take to be true facts are actually serving to make these problems even more difficult. So when someone is impressed upon or confronted with facts that countervail their adopted or assumed belief system, there are all these sort of weird psychological mechanisms in play to avoid integrating these supposed facts or truths into the worldview. Okay, so does that make sense? Does anyone have any further comments or questions about that? Is anyone here?
I'm here.
Okay, well, let's just take a break. So I'll see you guys in 5 minutes or so. Okay. So let's jump into David Lewis's paradoxes of time travel. And we will have the occasion to talk about other problems or metaphysical aspects of time that aren't explicitly taken up by Lewis. But what exactly is, for those who were able to do the reading, what is Lewis's argument? So what is the point of this paper that came out, I think it was 1986. Oh, excuse me, 76, right? So what is the major upshot of Lewis's argument here? What is he trying to show?
I guess he's kind of trying to show that maybe time travel is somewhat plausible.
Yeah, it's possible, right? He's trying to show that it's possible, and he's not giving us blueprints for a time machine or any sort of empirical set of empirical facts as to the material conditions or technological constraints that are involved in time travel as a pragmatic or practical possibility, right? So we're dealing, again, and this is something I mentioned in the context of Hume, we're operating here at the level of logical possibility, that is to say, conceivability. And so many scientific researchers in the field, in cosmology, for example, think that if time travel is possible, then it would only be possible for the future. And what's preventing us from time traveling into the future in a way that's different from the way in which we are presently, arguably, time traveling, given that we're standing here and time is passing, whatever it is that prevents us from jumping abruptly or expansively into the future is technology, is really an issue of limited power. But for this discussion, we're talking about the logical possibility of time travel. And logical possibility is stronger. It is bigger in scope than physical possibility. So for example, it's logically possible for me as a human being to fly. It's logically conceivable that at some point through evolution, for example, I will develop the physical means by which to achieve flight comparable to birds or winged insects or whatever else. That is to say, there's nothing logical in terms of conceptual definitions, for example, that would prevent me from conceiving of the possibility of natural human flight. Yet, we should all understand that as a matter of physical possibility, it's impossible, right? So logical possibility, and this is the idea that Hume gives us in that reading, logical possibility constitutes the absolute limit of thought. So conceivability is the absolute limit of thought. So I can conceive of a gold mountain, right? Even though I've never encountered one in my experience, but that's only because I have simple ideas which I can form a composite out of. Yet there's nothing I can do even with simple ideas to arrive at the conceivable conclusion that I'm standing and not standing, or that 2 + 2 = 7, right? So that's really still the level at which we're operating here, the level of conceivability or logical possibility. Okay. And so there are many paradoxes that philosophers and scientists have arrived at through various lines of reasoning that would seem to bring us to the strong conclusion against the very logical plausibility or conceivability of time travel, leaving aside again questions of its of a pragmatic or practical or practicable nature. Okay. So this is Lewis's general argument. And through his argument, he attacks this sort of abstract argument on the basis of the nature of paradoxes. So we'll be dealing explicitly with these arguments. So the first premise, time travel gives rise to paradoxes. But first of all, what exactly is a paradox? Can anyone explain that in your own words? What does it mean to say, just given this first premise, that time travel gives rise to paradoxes? What's a paradox?
Isn't a paradox something that could happen if something changes in a situation, or something, I don't know how to explain it, something that seems couldn't happen, but actually can if the situation.
Good, yeah, so I like the way you're putting that at the end. So something that seems like it couldn't happen, but it actually can, or it could be the reverse. So that's helpful, but a paradox, just etymologically, what does this word mean? Well, it derives from the Greek, and it means, so doxa is a word for opinion, and para is a kind of preposition that indicates something being above or outside of or alongside. So a paradox would be something that is askance or sort of weird in relation to a received opinion about the world, about how reality functions. And so there have been many famous paradoxes as logical puzzles. One famous one goes back to Parmenides of Elea and his student Zeno. These are pre-Socratic Greek philosophers, so philosophers that existed and worked before Socrates. I'll just use to give the paradox, I'll use the example of leaving. So at the end of this class, I'm going to leave my office to go get some lunch. And between where I'm presently sitting and the door to my office is maybe 6 feet, right? So that means to be able to leave, I'll have to traverse or cross 6 feet. But to traverse 6 feet, I first have to cross 3 feet. To go 3 feet, I first have to cross 1.5 feet. To do that, I first have to cross 1/3 of a foot, or 3/4 of a foot, and then 1/3 of a foot, and then a fraction of that, and a fraction of that, and a fraction of that. In principle, ad infinitum. So space is divisible, as we understand, and an implication of that is space is infinitely divisible, right? So I could take this pen, for example, cut it in half, and then cut that half in half, cut that half in half, cut that half in half, and in principle go all the way down to the level of atoms, molecules, quarks, right? So then the paradox seems to be that I can leave my office at the end of this class, but then I can't leave my office at the end of this class because it would be impossible for me to ever reach the door, because I would have to cross an infinite amount of space to do so. So that's a paradox, because obviously I know I can just leave the room. It's not a physical difficulty at all, yet by this sort of mathematical conclusion, it seems that I can't, right? So that's just an example of a paradox. And so why is that a problem, though? Think about what we were saying earlier in connection to Hume, that the absolute limit of thought is conceivability, and whatever we cannot conceive of is only that which implies a contradiction. So I can conceive of all kinds of weird shit. Like I said, I can conceive of playing pool, and when I strike the 9 ball, it turns into Kanye West. I can conceive of touching a fire and it feeling like Jello. I can conceive of opening the door to my office and the floor in the hallway being replaced by an abyss. I can conceive of all sorts of things. I can conceive of the sun flying away to a different solar system rather than rising tomorrow. I can conceive of all of these things because none of them suggest a contradiction. But that's precisely what we find in a paradox, a kind of contradiction. I can leave my office at the end of class, and I can't leave my office at the end of class. That would be comparable to saying 2 + 2 = 4 and 2 + 2 = 7. And so that was a perplexing, really worrisome possibility when it came to Descartes, if you remember, from his skeptical arguments, right? So the idea then is if time travel as a very logical possibility would seem to give rise to paradoxes, and the very nature of a paradox as being contradictory tells us the limits of what is conceivable. And if we understand that which is conceivable to be in some important way connected to the nature of reality, well, then it seems that the very arising or emergence of paradoxes from this field of possibility suggests its impossibility. Does that make sense? So if time travel gives rise to one or another paradox, then paradoxes would be possible. But since a paradox amounts to a precise contradiction, that which cannot be conceived of, and that which would then be, strictly speaking, the very opposite of knowledge, it's not possible. So then we can conclude that by definition, since paradoxes are not possible, and if time travel gives rise to paradoxes, then time travel is not possible. And so Lewis is attacking this argument, by the way. So this is not the argument that he's making. He wants to attack this. So he wants to show that what appear to be paradoxes are ultimately resolvable or at least dismissible in some way. Okay. So just a few things about the nature of time. So we can discuss the topology of time, that is to say, the structure or shape of time. Is it bounded or unbounded? In other words, was there a beginning? Did the cosmos originate at some determinate moment? Or is it, as the ancient Greeks like Aristotle thought, eternal? So for Aristotle, the cosmos, which means the all or the ordered whole, was never created. It simply is. But then the hypothesis or the theoretical posit of the beginning of the universe, such as the Big Bang theory, well, that suggests that the universe did begin at a particular time, and you might say point in space as well. But then here's a question that was explored thousands of years ago by figures like Parmenides, and a little more recently by the medieval theologian and philosopher St. Augustine. We might ask, and this applies too to the idea that's traceable to certain religious traditions like biblical scripture, that God created the universe at a particular moment, right? So that means there was time X, at which point there was nothing, and then there was time Y, at which point the cosmos came into being. But there's a puzzle there. There's a problem there, right? Because if temporality or time itself is a necessary component or feature of reality, that is to say, of the cosmos or of the universe, what sense does it make to say that the universe began at a particular moment in time? So, for example, Augustine asked the question, what was God doing before the creation of the universe? And another way to put that question is, what was God doing before the creation of time? Well, that's a really serious puzzle, because before is a temporal preposition, which implies the prior existence of time. And this is a spatial difficulty too, because if we suppose that the cosmos was created because, for example, of the Big Bang, we can still ask, well, where did the very materials that were condensed profoundly at that moment of creation, where did they come from? Or where exactly did this occur? If the universe involves space just as much as it involves as a necessary component to its organization time, well then where was it that the Big Bang happened? Or theologically speaking, where was it that God's creative work happened if there was no where to begin with? Does that make sense? So these are questions of time before we even get into the question of time travel. Is time continuous or is it discrete? That is to say, is it comparable to, can we say that it's analog or digital? So the way in which an analog clock, for example, has the hands just sort of smoothly moving through the various points of measure, or a digital clock where there seems to be a sort of abyss between 10:59 and then 1 o'clock, or excuse me, 11 o'clock when the hour changes. So that is to say, or that is to ask, do we carve up time as we do through chronological approaches, such as through the instruments of clocks and so forth? Is that just a human intervention, or does that have to do with temporality as such? Another question, is time linear or is it closed? So does time move from the past into the future in a unidirectional sort of motion? And the timeline would be infinite. So more understanding it as infinite, we would be looking at it in terms of an infinite past and then an infinite future. And there's just a line that runs through. Or there's the idea that temporality as a part of space-time, as an overall structure, which scientists understand is gravity, really, is bounded. So we'll talk about the eternal return or eternal recurrence in just a moment. But yeah, Karina, did you want to say something?
Didn't Hume, in his musings on the nature of the self, assert that time is an illusion, and that it's just the way, like it's just how we describe our perception of moving through the universe in a temporal fashion?
Yeah, he didn't say that explicitly, but I think you're right about that, because he talks about even perceptible qualitative changes in vegetables, right? To deny the truth of identity, even when it comes to non-sentient beings. And so we think that there's identity, but that's in part a kind of, like you said, illusion or fiction that's impressed upon our feeling or our sentiment that results in time. And David Lewis is going to sort of agree with that in the sense that time is really temporal change. So if there were no determinate changes, we wouldn't even have the concept of time. And so David Lewis makes the argument then, as we'll see, that change, temporally speaking, is a qualitative difference between stages in the perduring identity of a given entity. And so this is something that we talked about implicitly, at least in the context of the John Perry dialogue. If you remember the beginning of the second night, Miller proposed this strange person stages theory of self or personal identity, such that a person is a series of stages, each of which, so each part or stage is causally related in the important or necessary way to other stages. And that's something that's really important that we'll talk about today. But yeah, so if there were no changes, then we wouldn't really have an understanding of time. And change is something that we experience through impressions. And those impressions often give us false beliefs, right? So I think that you're right to say, from a kind of Humean perspective, time metaphysically would be a kind of illusion, right? But I think he would say that it's an illusion that we are naturally constituted to orient ourselves to the world along with, if that makes sense. But yeah, so that's I appreciate that comment. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. And then this is something that comes up very briefly, first at the beginning of Lewis's article, and then at the end, when he entertains this as a possible solution to the famous grandfather paradox. Is time branching or non-branching? So Lewis, as an analytic philosopher, an American philosopher, he was also a modal logician. So he contributed to the field of modal logic. And he was a really strange figure in that he adopted what's known as modal realism. So according to Lewis, so what do I mean by modality? Well, one mode or modality is possibility versus necessity, right? So something is possible versus something is impossible versus something is necessary versus something being contingent. So it could be the case or it might not be the case given X, Y, and Z circumstances in the world. Well, for Lewis, when we're talking about the modality of possibility, so think about what you ate for breakfast this morning. I ate a banana, but I could have eaten an English muffin or something like that. So for David Lewis, when I made the choice, when I made the decision to eat the banana rather than the English muffin, it was possible for me to eat the English muffin, which means that there is a possible world in which I did eat the English muffin rather than the banana. And for Lewis, that is not just a possible world, but it has some kind of reality to it and a different dimension. So there is some parallel dimension in which the world is following or shaping up at the conclusion of my having eaten, for example, an English muffin rather than a banana. And so that would be a sort of branch off of the timeline in which I am experiencing the world through my own life. There would be a kind of branching off in which there is an alternative parallel, Justin Harmon eating this other breakfast food, right? And so he uses this notion of branching timelines as one possible solution, although that's not the one that he prefers for the purposes of the paper, but we will talk about that a bit. And then there are additional problems, determinism. So think about the necessity that we associate with cause and effect, leaving aside the skepticism that we might have of that, having learned from Hume now. But if everything that happens in terms of actions or events occur as the effect of some prior cause, then you could say, strictly speaking, the past causes the future, which would seem to eliminate the role for freedom or free will. So that's one area of this ongoing debate, that between determinism and free will. And then this is the problem we're dealing with, time travel, and the arguments that seem to find that it results in these intractable paradoxes or problems. So just real quick, this is because it's an interesting thought experiment. This is the famous sort of proto-existential 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who, among other things, is most famous for his impressive mustache. But this is an aphorism taken from his work, The Gay Science, from 1882. So what if a demon crept after you into your loneliest loneliness some day or night and said to you, "This life, as you live it at present and have lived it, You must live it once more, and also innumerable times. And there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and every sigh, and all the unspeakably great, or excuse me, small and great in thy life must come to you again, and all in the same series and sequence. And similarly, this spider and this moonlight among the trees, and similarly, this moment and I myself. The eternal sandglass of existence will ever be turned once more, and you with it, you speck of dust. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon that so spoke? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment in which you would answer him, "You are a god, and never did I hear anything so divine"? If that thought acquired power over you as you are, it would transform you and perhaps crush you. The question with regard to all and everything, do you want this once more, and also for innumerable times, would lie as the heaviest burden upon your activity. Or how you have to become favorably inclined to yourself and to life, so as to long for nothing more ardently than for this last eternal sanctioning and sealing. So scholars interpret this differently. Some see it as a thought experiment to gauge your own orientation as one of a healthy nature or a pathological or decadent nature with respect to your own life. Are you living life in such a way that you would passionately affirm to live every moment, no matter how crushingly dull or anxiety-inducing or glorious, to relive these moments again and again, eternally? So this is how you are interpreting the pronouncement of the demon. Or would you see it as the most horrific condemnation you could ever anticipate or conceive of, to live this miserable drudgery over and over again? But other scholars interpret this as a kind of metaphysical principle, such that reality in its temporal structure is organized in such a way that it's circular rather than linear. So the idea might be that once you die, you are immediately reborn as yourself to go through every event, every experience that you had, again and again. And perhaps this very life that you're presently living is the millionth version. So has anybody seen the movie Groundhog Day with Bill Murray? That's a kind of cinematic exploration of this idea, except in the context of that film, Bill Murray's character is capable of making changes. And that seems to be impossible from the design of this experiment here. Okay. And so this is the idea that, to put it a different way, that time is a flat circle. And so that's sometimes the metaphor that scholars use to explain this insight. Time is a flat circle. And I drew a kind of simple picture to depict what that would mean. So if you can see this. So imagine the circle, which appears as a shape clearly circular to the eye. If we're imagining this in three-dimensional space, if you were to push that circle back, it would appear to be a line from your present vantage. So the idea is, from the order of our ordinary, everyday, lived, finite experience, the world seems to be organized temporally as a kind of linear progression. But if we were able to get out of the specificity of our finite perspective on the world, then we would see it's ultimately circular from a kind of God's eye view or perspective, as it were. What do you guys think about this? Do you have any thoughts about this? Or does this make sense?
Well, I think kind of the real difference between Groundhog Day and this is the awareness of undergoing the experience of perpetually reliving your life. And I think that it kind of goes back to the idea that none of this fundamentally affects how you live your life. And so there isn't a lot of worth to be gleaned from considering it.
Yeah, because you can't change anything, right? Yet there is a profound change, at least as Nietzsche seems to suggest it. It's a kind of subjective transformation. And this is in alignment with what's surprisingly a kind of strong Nietzschean optimism. So especially towards the end of his career, he vowed to be a yes-sayer above all else, to be an affirmer, a passionate affirmer of even the darkest, most miserable or mundane aspects of what it means to exist. And he thought that the way in which this is possible is largely through artistic creation, taking that which is crushing or overwhelming or terrifying or repulsive and transforming it in its truth into something beautiful and life affirmative. So I'm sure everyone's heard the cliche, when life hands you lemons, what are you supposed to do with them?
Make lemonade?
Right. That's not what Nietzsche would say. He would say, when life hands you lemons, shut up and eat your damn lemons and enjoy them. Recognize that you are eating a lemon. Don't try to alter the essential character of that through the falsity of sugar. You should recognize that you're eating lemons and enjoy it. Learn to enjoy it. And so, as a kind of, yeah, as a kind of thought experiment, then the idea is this demon in coming to you in your loneliest moment might be giving you a chance to rethink every experience that you've lived and to affirm it rather than denying that which seems to be at odds with your deepest desires and so forth. So there's a sort of element of stoicism involved in this. Okay. So we'll just do a couple more things and then we'll finish and we'll begin next class's session working through these other arguments. But I want to get through just the first paradox. So we'll examine the first paradox. And that's really the paradox that puts us in a place to understand the nature of time and qualitative temporal change. But first, some of these assumptions. So enduring things. So I, as a body, am an enduring thing. This coffee cup is an enduring thing. In other words, objects that are taken to exist as present. Enduring things have temporal as well as spatial parts. And this is another really strange and provocative feature of Lewis's metaphysics. So this is quite controversial. So it's well understood, accepted, and recognized that physical objects, enduring things, have spatial parts. So for example, I can remove the cap of this pen. So that would be a part of the pen, just like the ball point of it is a part. In terms of my own body, I am an articulated whole made up of various parts, organs, appendages, and so forth. So that's well understood, but Lewis argues that every enduring thing, in addition, has spatial parts, or excuse me, temporal parts. So just as I am a whole that's constituted of various physical bodily organs and extremities, I am a whole that's composed of segments of my identity that are brought together causally, but issue or come forth in their presence at different historical or temporal moments. So think about scars, for example. So I have several scars on my body, and we can see those as marks of qualitative difference that would distinguish, that would separate in my memory, for example, different temporal parts that make up me. So I had a bit of skin cancer removed from above my right eye several years ago at this point. So I can look at the scar and say, this is a physical mark that separates the temporal part of me that existed before I underwent this surgical procedure and the part of me that existed after that, right? So you can take really any physical object, that is any enduring thing, and identify it, carve it up or analyze it in these ways. So I can look at the desk that I'm working at, and it's a particularly old, ugly, and shitty desk. And so I can examine it and see how old and shitty it is. And I can tell that it has been worn down through its perduring as a sort of causal mechanism in which earlier parts of it were retained and conditioned and giving rise to subsequent parts. And so this connects to the John Perry reading, personal identity criteria. So we can look at, from Lewis's vantage, different standards or criteria, elements that would be necessary for the connectedness of different historical moments of my own lived experience and the psychological continuity that brings those together, in accordance with which I'm able to say, I had breakfast this morning, or I had surgery on my face 7 years ago, or something like that. So these temporal parts would then contribute to the mechanism by which these criteria are met and satisfied for personal identity. And he makes a distinction, and this is how he begins the piece, really, the essay. He makes a distinction between external and personal time, or time as such. You might call it objective time versus personal time. Okay. So the four-dimensional world. The world, whether we're discussing a time traveler, the world in which time travel is possible, or ours, is a four-dimensional manifold of events, of which time is one dimension of the four. So we talk about three-dimensional space, which includes a point, a line or extension that can grow or emerge from that point, and then depth, the third dimension, right? Well, time, temporality, is the fourth dimension. And it's by means of that dimension that we're able to recognize and calculate and reckon in various ways qualitative differences, that is, change. But time in itself remains one-dimensional. At the beginning of the essay, he considers one theoretical approach to this question, or these questions, such that time might be multidimensional. So he entertains the possibility, very briefly, that it's two-dimensional. But then he quickly leaves that aside because it's really a hallmark of the contemporary scholarship on this area that time is the fourth dimension, which means it is one dimension, unlike space, which is composed of three. And so that's what's meant by how no two time-like dimensions are orthogonal. Orthogonal meaning, in other words, intersectional. So, for example, you can have depth that arises because of a line or a plane that grows from a point and then a line. And so you could take that plane, if you were doing some geometrical work, and you could draw along, say, an X and a Y axis, plotting a point in a plane, and the lines would run across each other. And that would give you a spatial dimension such that you could say object A is deeper than object B, or something like that. But time remains one-dimensional because there is no X and Y axis along which there would be an intersection with it. And so then, enduring things, as we've come to understand them, objects in the world are time-like streaks. So they have spatial parts, which is the recognition by which we're able to identify something as what it is and to distinguish it from other objects, but they're also composed of temporal parts. So this idea of person stages. So I am identical to who I was several years ago when I underwent surgery for cancer, because that was one of my earlier person stages, which connected to a subsequent person stage causally. That is, it was the cause, the surgery, of subsequent effects of my having this scar, for example, of my feeling a bit of pain from it afterwards. And then now, several years later, my talking about this as an example. So there's a proper causal mechanism that brings these earlier stages together. And futurally, I am sort of moving as an ongoing temporal worm, as it were, in that direction, such that I am gaining new segments. That is, segments that will eventually become a part of my own personal history. So temporal change then is a qualitative difference. So changes that happen in time, that's a qualitative difference between stages, the different temporal parts of something. Just like if you were to look at a landscape outside of your window and you would see on the west a particular patch of trees, and then on the east you would see some mountains. So as your eye scans from west to east, you notice differences in quality, the quality of the objects that you perceive, and the colors and other sensory data that delimit them. Temporal change is just like that, but we're dealing with qualitative differences between different stages. And so this is we won't deal with the first paradox. We just don't have time for that. But I just want to give you this representation, this visual representation of Lewis's person stage theory of personal identity and his temporal parts theory. And this is really a theory of identity broadly, and not just personal identity. And so everything that exists, that is, every enduring object, including our own physical bodies, exists as space-time worms that are made up of, in addition to the physical parts that constitute our wholeness, these temporal parts or temporal stages. So for example, let's say this little sliver was my experience of undergoing surgery, and then that was related to these subsequent stages, such that you could trace this directional development or evolution in consistent and intelligible ways. So you can snatch out one of these stages or moments in time that constitute your very being as causally related to those stages that it's contiguous to, that is near. And so very briefly, what is time travel? So we talked about what time is, but what is time travel? Well, the time elapsed from departure to arrival is the duration of the journey. So just like if you leave your home, get in your car, go to the grocery store, let's say it takes you 10 minutes. So the time that elapses from the moment you leave your house to the moment you arrive at the grocery store is the duration of the journey. But for a time traveler, the separation in time between departure and arrival is different then. It does not equal the duration of the journey. And this is really the first paradox, right? So let's say you're traveling to 40 years in the past, but to get there, it takes you 5 minutes. So you look at your wristwatch before your time machine gets going, and then you arrive 40 years into the past, and you look at your wristwatch, 5 minutes have elapsed, yet 40 years have elapsed, right? So that's the first paradox that Lewis is going to deal with. So I'll just stop sharing there since we're out of time, but are there any final questions or comments before we go? So we'll pick this up just where we left off, and then after a little bit transition to our group of presenters. But are there any questions? All right, guys, well, have a good weekend, or no, Have a good week. I'll see you Thursday.
Thank you.